Iran believed missiles and drone swarms would be enough to secure victory against the United States. But the Tehran regime is already waving the white flag on a front it never even managed to bring its forces to bear on: the energy battlefield. The naval blockade the United States imposed in the Strait of Hormuz is cutting through every economic lifeline Iran possesses, one artery at a time. When Tehran floated a compromise, reopen Hormuz, and shelve the nuclear question for later, Donald Trump dismissed it without a second glance. Then came a bombshell that blindsided Iran entirely and sent shockwaves rippling across the global stage. The United Arab Emirates announced a landmark decision regarding OPEC, simultaneously revealing an alternative export route capable of rendering Iran's most powerful leverage card, Hormuz, completely irrelevant. These developments are transforming Tehran's energy market into a scene of rapid collapse. Iran's oil economy is quite literally suffocating in real time. The countdown clock for the Tehran regime has started ticking. Iran has only 12 to 22 days of unused storage capacity remaining. The moment that window expires, Tehran will be compelled to slash another 1.5 million barrels from its daily oil output. At Chabahar, the only meaningful export terminal sitting outside Hormuz, where a typical day would see perhaps 5 vessels moored, more than 20 tankers and cargo ships now sit crammed together, going nowhere. The U.S. naval blockade has gutted Iran's energy exports by 70%. Tehran is hemorrhaging $13 billion every single month. That is not a typo. A staggering sum is vanishing from the country's financial books month after month. Conditions have grown so desperate that, as a last resort, the Iranian regime has begun repurposing decommissioned, half-rotted vessels as makeshift floating storage units. But behind the visible chaos, an even darker and more dangerous picture is developing inside the regime itself. The storm gathering within Iran's inner circles is far more severe than what's visible from the outside. Iran's Supreme National Security Council has been flashing deeply alarming signals, warning that the deteriorating economy could ignite anti-regime protests at any moment. Even more telling, the Council has cited a specific and shockingly short estimate for how long Iran can survive the naval blockade. But that is far from the only threat on the horizon. Iran's labor market is staring down a catastrophe of its own. By the end of spring, millions of workers across the private sector could find themselves unemployed. In other words, a second crisis is already knocking on the door for both the IRGC and a regime that has every intention of continuing its standoff with Washington. Iran is being pulled inch by inch toward a position where it must lay every energy card it holds face up on the table and quietly accept defeat. Tehran's final energy weapon is no longer functioning. So how did all of this pile up so fast? The origins, the chain reaction, and the consequences of this stunning collapse will genuinely catch you off guard, because the very first miscalculation that drove the regime into this dead end was a strategic blunder of its own making. Instead of protecting its energy revenues, the regime chose to threaten Gulf states and seed the region with fear of prolonged war. That decision, made in Tehran's own corridors of power, is precisely what hung the regime with its own rope. That fatally flawed strategic choice pushed Iran into perhaps the most dangerous corner it has ever occupied. The seeds of the country's energy and storage crisis were planted at exactly that moment. The stark reality behind this crisis comes through clearly in a report by maritime intelligence firm Kepler. In March 2026, Iran's daily oil exports stood at 1.85 million barrels, Just 2 weeks after the blockade commenced, that number had cratered to 567,000 barrels. If this trajectory continues uninterrupted, Iran's storage infrastructure will reach full capacity in short order, and the moment it does, production must halt entirely. But the truly catastrophic danger isn't the short-term revenue loss. It is permanent industrial collapse. A significant share of the wells that get shut down will never return to their previous output levels. In petroleum engineering, this is known as irreversible production loss. Industry analysts place the permanent damage somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 barrels per day. Even if the blockade were lifted tomorrow, Iran's oil industry might never fully recover. This means the regime isn't just forfeiting today's income, it is destroying tomorrow's capacity as well. Tehran is not suffering a temporary economic shock. It is sustaining a permanent structural wound to its industrial foundation. A single prolonged conflict is erasing Iran's entire long-term vision for its energy sector. With the exit gates at Chabahar port now effectively sealed too, the losses may prove impossible to recover from. For years, this port served as Tehran's most prized strategic ace. It was Iran's plan B, the fallback in case Hormuz was ever cut off. Developed with Indian investment, it also served as the primary exit point for the China and Russia-backed international north-south transport corridor. Tehran had long presented Chabahar as one of its most irreplaceable strategic assets. Now, the wall of the U.S. Navy is rising in front of Plan B as well. Tankers stranded at the port cannot move because American naval forces are intercepting every Iran-affiliated vessel operating in the Gulf of Oman. The Tehran regime is watching in real time as the alternative route it spent years promoting degrades into a graveyard of captive tanker and and it has nothing resembling a Plan C. What makes the situation even more stunning is that India has quietly shelved its investment in Chabahar and inked a new deal with the UAE's Fujairah. In other words, Iran's strategic bridge to Asia is being abandoned by its own partners. This represents an unprecedented erosion of Tehran's regional geopolitical standing. Even countries that once maintained ties with Iran are backing away, concluding that doing business with Tehran has simply become too great a risk. One of the Middle Eastern states that reached that conclusion is the UAE, and its decision to exit OPEC is the clearest declaration of that judgment. But what truly rattled Tehran was not the OPEC announcement itself. It was the geopolitically devastating location at the heart of the decision's impact. The focus is on the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, a critical artery controlled entirely by the UAE. This 380-kilometer line carries crude oil directly to the Gulf of Oman without passing through the Strait of Hormuz at any point. Since March 2026, exports flowing through Fujairah have surged by 57%. The pipeline is currently pumping approximately 1.9 million barrels per day. By exiting OPEC, the UAE will be free to inject an additional 1 million barrels per day onto global markets, unconstrained by any production quota. Iran's entire Hormuz leverage strategy appears set to collapse under the weight of a single Emirati maneuver. While Iran cannot find a single viable export route beyond Hormuz, the UAE is throwing open a major artery that bypasses it entirely. The consequences of this for Iran's position in the global energy market are immense. OPEC's share of global supply control has already slipped from 30% to 26%. For Iran, this figure is a disaster indicator because OPEC's production quotas were the mechanism keeping oil prices elevated. Higher prices meant that even Iranian crude sold through back channels despite the blockade, still generated meaningful revenue. The UAE's exit threatens to unleash a wave of new supply that drags prices sharply lower. Iran, meanwhile, is simultaneously losing both export volume and per-barrel revenue. A two-front loss, and there is no strategic buffer left to absorb it. It is no surprise, then, that this perfect storm is shaking Iran to its foundations. And at the center of the resulting earthquake is the looming economic catastrophe the country is being dragged toward. A report published exclusively by Iran International on April 27, 2026, rippled through the world's press in a wave of disbelief. Iran's Supreme National Security Council, chaired by Mohammad Bakr Zolgadar, had convened on an emergency basis. But this was no routine gathering. The assessment that leaked from the meeting read less like a strategic briefing and more like a document of defeat. The council had arrived at three core conclusions. First, protests could erupt again within days. Economic pressure has already reached the threshold of a primary trigger. Second, the regime can withstand the blockade for a maximum of 6 to 8 weeks. Third, by the end of spring, nearly 2 million jobs could evaporate from the private sector. Security officials distilled the entire situation into a single sentence: unrest is inevitable, only its timing remains uncertain. In other words, the regime's own internal security apparatus is formally acknowledging, in writing, that it could lose control of the streets within a matter of weeks. This is not a leaked fear or an unofficial rumor. It reads more than anything like a preliminary plan for surrender. For years, the Iranian regime had built its propaganda around the concept of a fortress economy, a resistance economy that laughed at sanctions, a shielded system immune to external pressure. All of that language is now hollow. These same officials are now committing to paper the fact that their fortress has only 6 to 8 weeks of life left. The social fury that was suppressed in January could reignite under renewed economic strain, and the Council's own warning makes that explicit. The question is no longer whether it will happen. The question is which day it will. On another front, the regime's acknowledgement of collapse does not end with internal security warnings. Even figures at the very summit of Iranian political authority have now come to comprehend the full weight of the U.S. blockade and its global implications. Among them is Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. On April 25, 2026, he appeared on national television to address the Iranian people. The speech was a deeply humiliating moment for a regime that has spent decades projecting an image of defiant strength. Pezeshkian openly appealed to citizens to reduce their electricity consumption. His advice was startling in its bluntness. Instead of switching on 10 light bulbs in your home, turn on 2. The president of a country that has long boasted of its military prowess and regional dominance was reduced to asking his own citizens to count their light bulbs. It may well be the most diminishing statement any leader of that nation has ever had to make on live television. But Pezeshkian had no other card to play. Government offices have shifted to half-day operating schedules. Heating in the Tehran metro is being regularly cut. In major cities, including Isfahan and Tabriz, street lighting has been reduced by half. The Iranian rial has collapsed to 1.8 million against the dollar over just the past 2 months. Annual inflation has surpassed 40%. Queues for bread, meat, and dairy products are growing longer by the day. Prices for imported medicine have climbed nearly 60%. Pezeshkian's public plea reflects a reality the regime, despite all the machinery of its state media, can no longer conceal from its own population. The social contract it had purchased through decades of subsidies is unraveling, and a sitting president is essentially begging his people not to become the spark that ignites the next explosion. The question worth asking is, why did the regime allow things to reach this point? The answer is that Iran's economic crisis did not begin with the blockade. For years, a substantial portion of the country's oil revenues was being siphoned directly into the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and from there into Hezbollah in Lebanon, into the Houthis in Yemen, into Shia militias across Iraq, and into the so-called resistance network that once operated out of Syria. Now that funding artery is clogged. In Lebanon, Hezbollah has reportedly reached the point of being unable to meet its own payroll. In Yemen, the Houthis are burning through their last drone stockpiles. In Iraq, Shia proxy militias are withdrawing from the field because funding has stopped arriving. Within just a few weeks, the Iranian regime stands on the verge of watching the proxy war network it spent 4 decades constructing simply dissolve. Every soldier, every missile, every drone, every proxy faction, all of it runs on money, and money is no longer flowing into Tehran's treasury. For years, the IRGC had thundered its warnings about merciless responses to any perceived threat. But the blockade silenced that rhetoric with a single move. It cut off the cash. This quiet financial collapse is systematically dismantling Iran's military deterrence because the regime had always derived its regional weight from its investment in proxy warfare. Now the pipeline of that investment is running dry, and Tehran's regional influence is evaporating at a pace not seen in decades. The regime had for years chosen the IRGC elite and its proxy empire over the welfare of its own people. Now, with energy exports severed and economic crisis deepening, Iran is entering a process from which a return path barely exists. U.S. officials themselves have been issuing warnings about the trajectory. Among those voices is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who made a pointed statement on April 27, 2026. Iran's oil pumping capacity, he declared, will soon collapse. He went further, warning that a genuine gasoline shortage inside Iran could be imminent. An oil-producing nation whose citizens might be forced to line up for fuel. That is a paradox that rarely appears anywhere in the history of geopolitics. And within days of Bessent's statement, satellite imagery released through the U.S. Department of Defense only deepened the embarrassment. The images confirmed what intelligence analysts had suspected. With storage facilities filled beyond capacity, Iran has begun pressing decommissioned structurally compromised vessels into service as emergency floating storage units. Decaying ships that haven't put to sea in years now sit loaded with crude oil, acting as glorified parking lots for petroleum the country cannot sell. Iran holds one of the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, and yet it cannot find a single open corridor through which to move that oil. Hormuz is under blockade. Chabahar is choked. Fujairah belongs to the UAE. What remains for the Tehran regime is a fleet of rusting hulks anchored around its own ports, crude oil being pumped into their corroding hulls like water into a bucket full of holes. The exits are closing one by one. One of the more remarkable dimensions of all this is that despite these thunderclouds gathering overhead, the IRGC continues to refuse intrusive international inspection of its enriched uranium sites. The only plausible exit ramp for Tehran at this point may be granting unrestricted, immediate, and thorough access to all Iranian nuclear facilities by the International Atomic Energy Agency. But under relentless military pressure from the Revolutionary Guards, Iran's civilian government cannot even put that possibility on the table during negotiations. As any prospect of a deal with the United States fades, we are approaching the end of the 47-year myth of resistance. Since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the regime had built a foundational narrative around its capacity to endure, to outlast every sanction, every embargo, every resolution. "We have never been broken" was the cornerstone of decades of state propaganda. The 2026 blockade, however, is something qualitatively different from anything that came before it. This is not a sanctions package. It is a physical blockade. Sanctions can be circumvented through illicit channels, ship-to-ship transfers at sea, flag changes, AIS transponder shutoffs, but a physical blockade stops ships with bodies and steel, not paperwork and diplomatic pressure. A deactivated AIS signal is no barrier to Marines fast roping from helicopters onto a vessel's deck. A new flag does not make a tanker invisible to satellite tracking. The U.S. Navy is now monitoring individual tankers, identifying them, and boarding them when warranted. The tanker Tiffany was logged and stopped. The vessel Majestic X was seized. And on April 28, 2026, a Comoros-flagged ship called MV Blue Star 3 was intercepted in the Gulf of Oman. Marines from the U.S. 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit descended from helicopters and conducted a thorough search of the vessel. When its voyage plan showed no Iranian port of call, the ship was released, but the message required no translation. In and around Hormuz, no vessel approaches Iran without U.S. Navy authorization. These operations have made undeniably clear that the blockade is not a naval gesture or a show of force. It is a meticulously enforced legal and military encirclement. Every export attempt by sea now confronts Iran with the real risk of losing the ship involved. Insurance companies have canceled every transport policy covering the Hormuz corridor. Tanker owners have removed Iranian routes from their operational charts entirely. Even Asian buyers who once quietly purchased Iranian crude have abandoned the supply side at once because a U.S. Navy boarding is no longer a theoretical risk. It has become a near-routine occurrence. Iran's strategy of selling oil through shadow channels is being tracked in near real time by AWACS aircraft operating overhead and Sentinel-2 satellites mapping the sea surface. Every CENTCOM announcement represents another line erased from Iran's presence in the global oil market. What no sanctions package ever fully achieved in decades of pressure, the blockade is delivering in weeks. The Council's 6 to 8 week survival estimate is a direct product of this new reality. Resistance was once possible because it could be improvised and adapted. That space no longer exists. The world has not witnessed a physical naval blockade of this scale and sophistication in over 5 decades. The Soviet maritime encirclement during the Cuban Missile Crisis was short-lived. The Yugoslavia blockades were largely symbolic in nature. The maritime pressure campaigns on North Korea were narrow in scope, but this 2026 Iran blockade belongs in an entirely different category, broader in reach, more technically sophisticated, and more economically lethal than anything the modern era has seen Iran face. So what lies ahead for the regime? Analysts and observers can identify 3 plausible scenarios unfolding from this point. In the first scenario, the regime yields. Tehran brings its nuclear program to the negotiating table, grants comprehensive international inspection access, and Trump signs a sweeping agreement in exchange for lifting the blockade. Under this scenario, Iran's economy gets a lifeline. But the political cost inside the country could be severe. The Revolutionary Guards would almost certainly frame such a capitulation as treason against the revolution. The domestic political fallout could be unpredictable. In the second scenario, the regime holds its ground and the blockade continues. This is the path toward the eruption of the protests the council itself predicted. Domestic unrest could fuse with economic implosion, forcing the regime into another wave of violent crackdowns on its own population. History from January's protest cycle already provides a preview of what that could look like, and it was not a picture the regime wanted the world to see. In the third scenario, the United States makes a military move. A targeted high-tempo strike package prepared by CENTCOM could be activated. Iran's nuclear infrastructure and IRGC command nodes could come under direct attack. Should this scenario play out, Tehran would face a defeat of a magnitude that would dwarf anything the blockade alone could achieve. The 47-year myth of resistance is meeting the 2026 blockade, and the blockade is winning. The question for Tehran is no longer how to fight back. It is which form of surrender costs the least.